Right now, France has just recorded the hottest day in its entire history. Paris has pushed past 40 degrees Celsius, and records are falling across Western Europe in a single week. But here is what almost no one covering this heat will tell you. The temperature on the thermometer is not the number that decides whether you live. There is a second temperature, one most people have never heard of, and it measures something far more intimate than how hot the air is. It measures whether your body can still cool itself at all. That number is rising faster than the headlines. The line it marks is lower than scientists believed even a few years ago, and it is moving toward the most crowded places on Earth, including much of the country you're probably sitting in. If that unsettles you, take a second to subscribe to the Sky Lab, because this is exactly the kind of story we dig into when the rest of the coverage looks away. Drop a comment and tell me how the heat is where you're watching from, and whether you have felt it firsthand. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The number. Nobody is reading. Right now, as you watch this, the thermometers across Western Europe are climbing past numbers that no one has ever written down before. A second heat wave, the more violent of the two, built in around the 17th of June, in the last days before the summer solstice, and the records have been falling like a row of dominoes ever since. France has just recorded the hottest day in its entire history. Paris pushed past 40 degrees Celsius, reaching a June record of 40.9 degrees, which is about 106 degrees Fahrenheit. In Spain, the small town of Estación in Cantabria logged 43.7 degrees on the 23rd of June, and the country as a whole posted its highest daily average temperature since 1950. Britain broke its own June record, and then, one by one, the national records of Belgium, Germany, Ireland, Italy, and the Netherlands gave way too. In France alone, at least 18 people have died in this heat. Among the dead are 2 children and 3 elderly people, the two ends of the human age range, and dozens more drowned while reaching for any cool water they could find. An ocean away, at the very same moment, a dome of heat has swelled over the central and eastern United States, forecast to be the most widespread heat wave of the entire summer, and at night the temperatures are refusing to fall. It would be easy to think that this story is about those numbers, the records shattering on the thermometers, the figures climbing higher than they ever have. But it is not about those numbers, and that is the part almost no one is telling you. Because there is another temperature, one that most people have never heard of, and it is the one that actually decides whether a human body can survive. It does not measure how hot the air is. It measures something far more intimate than that. It measures whether your body can still cool itself at all. That number is rising faster than the headline heat. The line it marks is lower than scientists believed even a few years ago, and it is moving steadily and quietly toward the most crowded places on Earth, including the country where most of the people watching this right now actually live. This is the story of the moment heat stops being something we endure and becomes something we cannot survive. And it is the story of how close that line already is. To understand any of it, you have to set the headlines aside for a moment and go back to something much smaller and much more uncomfortable. You have to go back to a basic fact about your own body, because the real threat in this story is not the weather at all. The threat is the line where the weather wins. For almost the entire span of recorded history, the deadliest heat waves on Earth have been dry ones. They are the famous catastrophes, the ones that fill the record books with tens of thousands of names, the ones that get documentaries and inquiries and memorials. And yet, for all the horror they caused, almost none of them ever actually reached the point at which a human body physically stops being able to cool itself. They were terrible, but they killed in a particular way. They killed by wearing people down, slowly, over days. There is another kind of heat that does not wear you down. It overwhelms you. It does not care how much shade you find, how much water you drink, or how hard the wind is blowing across your skin. This is humid heat, and the scientists who study it use a single, quiet measurement to describe it. They call it the wet bulb temperature, and in the view of many of the people who study our warming world most closely, it is one of the most frightening things that warming is bringing. It has been rare so far. That is the only reason most people have never heard of it, but the line it measures is lower than science once believed, and it is moving toward the most crowded places on the planet, including much of the country you may be sitting in right now. So before we go back to those falling records in Europe and America, before we look at what is happening this week, We have to understand the machine that all of this acts upon. We have to understand how a human body sheds heat in the first place, and exactly where that system breaks. Because once you understand that, the headlines stop looking like a list of broken records. They start looking like a countdown. Part 2. The furnace you carry everywhere. Your body is, in the most literal sense, a furnace that never goes out. Every second that you are alive, the chemistry inside your cells is burning fuel to keep you running, and that burning throws off heat as a byproduct, the same way an engine does. To stay alive, your body has to hold its core temperature inside an astonishingly narrow band, right around 37 degrees Celsius, which is about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Stray too far above that, and the machinery starts to break. Proteins begin to deform, cells start to fail. The systems that keep your blood moving and your brain working slip out of tune, and they do it fast. The body has a whole set of tricks for staying inside that narrow band, but the single most important one is so ordinary that almost no one ever thinks about it. You sweat. That is the entire defense, the thing standing between you and your own internal furnace on a hot day. Sweat rises to the surface of your skin, it evaporates into the air, and as it evaporates, it carries heat away with it. That is not a metaphor. It is straight physics. Turning liquid water into vapor takes energy, and that energy is pulled directly out of your skin as the sweat lifts off, leaving you measurably cooler than you were a moment before. It is the same physics that cools a wet cloth laid across the back of your neck on a summer afternoon. It is the same physics that, for thousands of years, has kept water cool inside an unglazed clay pot in places that never had a refrigerator. The moisture seeping through the clay and evaporating off the outside, chilling what is held within. Your skin is that clay pot. Your sweat is that seeping water. And on an ordinary hot day, the system works so well that you barely notice it is working at all. But there is a condition hidden inside that simple system, a catch that almost no one thinks about until the day it matters. Evaporation only works if the surrounding air has room to accept more moisture. That is the whole thing. That is the hinge that this entire story turns on. Your sweat cannot evaporate into air that is already full of water, any more than you can pour more water into a glass that is already overflowing. In dry air, there is endless room. Sweat flashes off your skin almost as fast as your body can produce it. The cooling is brutally efficient, and your core temperature holds steady even when the air around you is blisteringly hot. This is why a person can stand in the desert at temperatures that sound impossible and still survive. The air is an open throat, swallowing every drop of moisture the body can offer and pulling the heat out with it. In humid air, everything changes. The air is already nearly full of water, so the sweat your body produces has nowhere to go. It does not evaporate. It beads on your skin. It drips. It soaks through your shirt and runs down your back, and it does almost nothing to cool you, because the heat it was supposed to carry away has nowhere to be carried. Your body keeps trying. It keeps pushing more and more sweat to the surface, draining your water and your salts, and it gets almost nothing in return. The single most important defense you have against heat simply stops working, while you stand there pouring with it. This is the fact that the headline temperature can never tell you on its own. The number on the thermometer measures how hot the air is. It says nothing about whether your body can actually shed its heat into that air. And those are two completely different questions, with two completely different answers, and only one of them decides whether you live. Sweat is the body's most powerful tool, but it is not the only one, and it is worth seeing the others because they fail in the same direction. Alongside sweating, the body fights heat by pushing blood toward the skin. When you overheat, your heart pumps harder, and your blood vessels near the surface widen, flooding the skin with warm blood so it can dump heat into the cooler air around you, the way a radiator carries an engine's heat to its fins. This is why a person flushes red in the heat. It is the cardiovascular system throwing everything it has at the problem, rerouting blood from the core to the surface in a bid to shed warmth. But this defense has a hidden cost, and the cost is what makes it dangerous for the vulnerable. Diverting all that blood to the skin means less is available for the brain, the gut, and the working muscles, and it forces the heart to labour far harder than usual, beat after beat, hour after hour. For a young and healthy person, that strain is survivable for a while. For an older person, or someone with a weakened heart, the demand can be more than the system can meet, which is exactly why so many heat deaths are recorded as cardiac events. The body, in trying to save itself from heat, places a load on the heart that a fragile heart cannot carry. And critically, this radiator trick only works while the air is cooler than the skin. Once the air temperature climbs past body temperature, the radiator runs backward, and the body begins absorbing heat from the air instead of shedding it to it. At that point, with the radiator failing, sweat becomes the only line of defense left, and we have already seen what happens to sweat when the air is too humid to accept it. The defenses do not fail independently, they fail together in the same conditions, leaving the body with nothing. So hold on to this, because everything that follows is built on it. Heat alone is not the enemy. Heat that your body cannot escape from is the enemy. And the thing that decides which one you are facing on any given day is not the temperature. It is the water already hanging invisibly in the air around you. Part 3. Why the swamp is deadlier than the desert. Once you understand that evaporation is the whole game, a strange and counterintuitive fact falls into place, and it is one that runs against almost everything our instincts tell us about heat. A humid day at 95 degrees Fahrenheit can be far more dangerous than a desert day at 110. The bigger number is not the more lethal one. The desert is brutal, no question, but your sweat is still evaporating out there, still pulling heat off your skin with every passing minute, still keeping your core temperature in the zone where you can survive. In the swamp, at a number that sounds 20 degrees safer, you are producing sweat and getting nothing back for it. You are running the defense at full power and the defense is doing nothing. That single inversion is the reason this subject is so badly misunderstood by almost everyone, including the people most at risk from it. We have been trained to fear the big number on the thermometer. We watch for the record high, the triple digits, the screaming red on the map, and all the while, the condition that can actually overwhelm a healthy human body in a matter of hours can arrive on a day that never even cracks 100, as long as the air is thick enough with water, and the people most exposed to that failure are, almost cruelly, the ones least able to absorb it. Older adults sweat less efficiently than the young, and their bodies regulate temperature more poorly to begin with. They more often carry conditions involving the heart and the lungs, the very systems that heat pushes straight to the edge, and the medications that manage those conditions can interfere with the body's cooling on top of it. Infants are vulnerable in their own way, with a large surface area, little ones who cannot tell anyone what is wrong, cannot fetch their own water, cannot move themselves somewhere cooler. Then there are the outdoor labourers who cannot simply stop working when the air turns dangerous, because stopping means not being paid, and there are the poor, who so often cannot escape to anywhere cooler because there is nowhere cooler for them to go. This is not a distant or exotic threat. Heat is already the deadliest weather hazard in the United States. Not floods, not tornadoes, not hurricanes, with all the coverage and all the fear they command. Heat. It quietly kills more Americans in an average year than any of those louder, more cinematic disasters, and it does it without the dramatic footage, without the spinning radar signatures, without the names we give to storms. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Even that grim ranking almost certainly undercounts the true toll, and it undercounts it badly. Heat rarely writes its own name on a death certificate. When extreme heat pushes a struggling heart past its limit, the cause of death gets written down as a heart attack. When it tips a failing body into collapse, it gets recorded as a stroke, or as kidney failure, or as one of a dozen other final events that heat set in motion but never gets blamed for. The official tally of heat deaths is the visible tip of something much larger, a number that everyone who studies it knows is far too low. When the body finally loses the contest with heat, it does not all happen at once, and understanding the stages helps explain why this kind of death is so quiet and so often misread. The first stage is heat exhaustion, and most people have brushed up against it at least once. The skin goes clammy, the head swims, the stomach turns, the muscles cramp, and a deep weakness sets in as blood is pulled away from the core and rushed toward the skin in a desperate attempt to dump heat. At this stage, the body is still fighting, still compensating, and if the person can get to shade and water and cooler air, they recover. This is the warning shot, the body's way of saying that the cooling system is being overwhelmed but has not yet failed. The second stage is the one with no easy way back, and it has a name that sounds clinical until you understand what it actually is: heat stroke. It is the point at which the core temperature climbs past roughly 40 degrees Celsius, around 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and the body's regulation collapses. In a cruel final turn, the sweating can actually stop, the skin going hot and dry, as the system that was supposed to save the body simply gives up. And then the damage moves inward, organ by organ. The proteins that do the work of life begin to unfold and stop functioning, the way an egg white turns solid and white in a hot pan and can never turn back. The gut lining grows leaky, releasing toxins into the blood. The kidneys, starved and overheated, begin to fail. The brain swells. The blood's ability to clot goes haywire. This is not a single failure, but a cascade, one system knocking over the next, and once it is far enough along, it continues even after the person is cooled, which is why heat stroke kills people in hospital beds hours and days after they were pulled from the heat. That cascade is the reason heat hides so well in the records. A person whose kidneys fail under heat stress is recorded as a kidney death. A person whose overstrained heart finally stops is recorded as a cardiac death. The heat lit the fuse, but the explosion gets named after the organ that happened to fail first, and the true cause walks away uncounted. Multiply that across an entire heat wave, across thousands of fragile bodies all pushed past their limits in the same week, and you begin to see why the people who study this are so certain that the official numbers are only the visible edge of something much larger. So we have a hazard that is already the deadliest of its kind, that is systematically undercounted, that falls hardest on the people least equipped to survive it, and that the public has been trained to measure with exactly the wrong number. That is the situation today, in the climate we already have. To see where it is going, and to understand what they are not telling you about the heat hitting the planet right now, we need a better number. We need the one measurement that captures all of this in a single figure. And to get it, scientists turn to a beautifully simple instrument, one you could practically build yourself with a thermometer and a wet sock. Part 4. The thermometer that sweats. To capture everything we have just talked about in a single figure, scientists turn to a measurement called the wet bulb temperature. The name is not poetry. It comes directly from the instrument that produces it, and the instrument is almost comically simple. You take an ordinary thermometer, the kind that measures the true temperature of the air, and you wrap its bulb, the sensing tip at the bottom, in a small wet sock, a wick kept constantly damp by sitting in water. That is the entire apparatus, a thermometer wearing a tiny wet sock. Now think about what happens to that wet sock. Water evaporates off of it, into the surrounding air, exactly the way sweat evaporates off your skin. And as that water evaporates, it cools the bulb underneath, pulling heat out of it the same way evaporation pulls heat out of you. So the thermometer reads lower than the true air temperature. It reads lower by precisely the amount of cooling that evaporation into that particular air will allow. The wet sock, in other words, is standing in for a human being. It is sweating, and it is recording how much good that sweating actually does. In dry air, a great deal of water evaporates off the wet sock. The cooling is strong, and the wet bulb reading sits far below the real air temperature. You might have a true temperature that sounds frightening, but a wet bulb reading well below it, and that gap is your margin of safety. It is the measure of how much room the air still has to accept your sweat. In saturated, soupy, humid air, almost nothing evaporates off the sock. There is almost no cooling, and the wet bulb reading climbs until it nearly meets the air temperature itself. The two numbers close in on each other, and the closer they get, the closer a real human body is to losing its ability to cool at all. That is the elegance of it, and the horror of it. The wet bulb temperature is a thermometer that sweats. It does not ask how hot the air is. It asks the only question that actually matters for survival, which is whether a body sweating into this exact air can still keep itself alive. When that little wet sock can no longer cool itself, that is your warning, in the clearest possible terms, that you can no longer cool yourself either. This is why you can have 2 days with the identical number on the regular thermometer, and one of them is merely uncomfortable while the other is potentially lethal. The wet bulb temperature can tell them apart. The ordinary thermometer cannot. And this is precisely the number that gets left out of almost every headline, every forecast graphic, every casual conversation about how hot it got today. We talk endlessly about the air temperature, the one number that, taken alone, cannot actually tell you whether the heat outside your door can kill you. You may be wondering at this point about the number you actually hear on the news, the heat index, the figure that tells you what the temperature feels like. The heat index is a real and useful thing, and it does try to fold humidity into the picture, which is more than the raw air temperature does. but it was designed to describe comfort and discomfort for a typical person in the shade, not to mark the absolute physical limit of survival, and it tends to be reported as a feels-like number rather than understood as a measure of danger. The wet bulb temperature is a colder, more fundamental quantity. It does not ask how the heat feels, it asks whether evaporation, the body's last defense, can function at all. Two numbers, two different jobs, and the one that actually marks the survival line is the one almost never spoken aloud. This gap in our shared vocabulary is not a small thing, because the words we have shape the dangers we can see. We have a rich everyday language for dry heat, for scorchers and heat waves and triple-digit days, and almost no everyday language for the humid heat that is genuinely more lethal. We feel the big air temperature number in our bones because we have been hearing it our whole lives. The wet bulb number, the one that should frighten us more, has no place in ordinary speech, no familiar threshold, no instinctive meaning, and so a region can walk toward the most dangerous condition it has ever faced while talking about it in the language of a hot afternoon, reassured by a vocabulary that was built for a different and gentler kind of heat. For a long time, the wet bulb temperature stayed locked away in the world of specialists, of atmospheric scientists and military physiologists, and a handful of climate researchers. It was an obscure technical quantity, something you would never hear mentioned on the evening news. The reason it is climbing out of the journals now, the reason it is starting to matter to ordinary people in ordinary cities, is that researchers went looking for the exact point at which that sweating thermometer stops being able to save the body it stands for. They went looking for the line, and what they found is that the line is closer than anyone had dared to assume. Part 5. The line you cannot cross. Scientists have a name for the point of no return, and like the name of the instrument, it is plain and clinical rather than dramatic. They call it the limit of compensability. It is the point past which the body can no longer compensate for the heat flowing into it, the point where, no matter what the body does, the incoming heat outpaces every cooling trick it has, and the core temperature begins to climb on its own, uncontrollably. Below that line you can hold steady. You sweat, you struggle, you suffer, but you hold. Above that line, the holding stops, and the internal temperature simply rises, hour by hour, toward the values where the body fails. The obvious problem is that you cannot study that limit the obvious way. You cannot put a human being in a chamber and heat them until they die in order to find out exactly when it happens. It would be monstrous, and no one would ever allow it. So researchers did something cleverer and far more humane, and in its own quiet way quite ingenious. They built carefully controlled chambers, rooms where they can dial the temperature and the humidity to any combination they choose, and they invited in healthy volunteers. Inside those chambers, the volunteers go about light activity, while the researchers raise the heat and the moisture step by step, slowly, carefully, watching the whole time. And the thing they are watching, the crucial measurement, comes from inside the volunteer's own body. The volunteers swallow a small ingestible capsule, a tiny electronic thermometer that travels through the digestive tract and radios out the body's true core temperature from within, continuously, in real time. So the researchers are not guessing from the skin or the forehead. They are reading the actual internal temperature, the number that matters, second by second. They raise the conditions gradually, and for a long stretch the volunteer's core temperature holds steady because the body is compensating, shedding heat as fast as it takes it in. And then, at a certain combination of heat and humidity, that line on the screen does something it had not been doing. It stops holding flat. It begins, slowly but unmistakably, to climb. That is the moment. That is the edge. The instant the core temperature starts to rise and will not come back down, the researchers know they have found the limit of compensability for that person, in those conditions, and they stop. They go no further. They have what they came for, and they have it without anyone coming to harm. It is worth pausing on what that rising curve on the screen actually represents, because it is easy to look at a graph and forget that it is a person. When the core temperature line bends upward and refuses to come back down, what the researchers are watching is the precise moment a human body crosses from the world of the survivable into the world of the unsurvivable, and they are watching it happen gently, safely, in a volunteer who will walk out of the chamber unharmed because they stop the instant the line turns. But in the real world, outside the chamber, no one stops the experiment. The conditions do not get dialed back the moment the curve bends. The heat simply continues, and the curve continues with it, climbing toward the temperatures where the cascade begins. What the chamber studies give us, then, is a kind of map of the cliff edge drawn without anyone having to fall off it. They tell us exactly where the ground gives way, for different kinds of people, in different mixes of heat and humidity, and they do it with a precision that the old theoretical estimates could never reach. The theory had to assume an idealized body, a perfect sphere of physiology, reasoning from first principles. The chamber works with actual human beings, with all their messy variation, their real sweat rates and real blood flow and real limits, and that is exactly why the chamber number came in lower than the theory. Real bodies are not idealized. They have inefficiencies and constraints that the clean math left out, and every one of those inefficiencies moves the true limit closer than the optimistic ceiling suggested. There is one more thing the chamber studies quietly revealed, and it matters for everything that follows. The limit is not a single sharp number even for one person. It shifts with what they are doing. A body at rest generates a small amount of internal heat. A body working, walking, labouring, lifting generates far more. And all of that self-generated heat has to be shed through the same overwhelmed cooling system, on top of the heat pouring in from the environment. So the harder a person is working, the lower the outside conditions need to be to push them over the edge. This is why the danger falls so heavily on the people who cannot stop working, the labourers in the fields and on the construction sites, whose own exertion stacks on top of the heat and drags their personal limit down toward conditions that a resting person might have survived. What makes this work so important is that it replaced a guess with a measurement. For years, the number people quoted for the human limit had come from theory, from physics and reasoning about what a body ought to be able to withstand. The chamber studies took that theory and tested it against real human bodies, real core temperatures, real lines on a screen bending upward, and when the measurements came back, they carried a message that the theory had not prepared anyone for. The real human body, it turned out, gives out sooner than the math had promised. The line was not where we thought it was lower. And to understand why that single word, lower, is so alarming, you have to know what the old number was and where the new one landed. Part 6. The number that keeps dropping. For a long time, the figure that got quoted for the absolute limit of human heat tolerance was a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius. It came from a theoretical study by two researchers, Stephen Sherwood and Matthew Huber, published in the year 2010. Their reasoning was elegant and grim. At a sustained wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees, they argued, a human being could not survive, even an idealized one, even at complete rest, even in the shade, even with unlimited drinking water, because at 35 degrees wet bulb the air is so saturated and so hot that sweat can no longer shed the body's own metabolic heat, the heat you generate just by being alive. At that point the body cooks itself from the inside slowly, with nothing it can do to stop it. But that same study contained something that, at the time, looked almost reassuring. The hottest places on Earth, even the most savage corners of the planet, maxed out at the time around a wet bulb temperature of 31 degrees. We had a margin. There were 4 whole degrees of wet bulb between the worst the planet was actually producing and the theoretical line where a resting human in the shade could no longer survive. 4 degrees sounds like a comfortable buffer. It sounded for a while like the unsurvivable wet bulb was a problem for the distant future, if it was a problem at all. Then the chamber experiments came and the margin shrank. A project at Pennsylvania State University, often referred to simply as PSU Heat, led by researchers including Daniel Vecellio, did exactly what we just described. They put young, healthy, fit adults into the chambers, swallowed the capsules and measured the real line directly in real bodies, rather than deriving it from theory. And the number they found was not 35. For those young, fit subjects, the limit of compensability sat closer to 30 or 31 degrees wet bulb. And in hot, dry conditions where other factors came into play, it was lower still. Sit with that for a moment. The theoretical ceiling, the 35-degree figure that had anchored the public conversation for over a decade, had been too generous. The human body, even a young and healthy one, gave out several degrees sooner than the clean physics had promised. The supposed worst case turned out to be optimistic. and the margin that had felt so comfortable, that gap between what the planet was producing and what a body could take, was suddenly much, much thinner than anyone had advertised. Then, very recently, a major review pulled all of this work together, published in the journal Nature Reviews Earth and Environment in the year 2025 by a team led by the researcher Colin Matthews. It gathered up the chamber studies and the field data and the theory, and it widened the frame in a way that is genuinely sobering. There is not one single universal threshold, it concluded. There is a range. And that range runs from about 19 degrees wet bulb at the low end, all the way up to about 32 degrees at the high end, depending on a person's age, on how hard they're working, and on the exact mix of heat and humidity they are facing. Now, 19 degrees sounds impossibly mild. It sounds like a pleasant spring afternoon, and this is the single point that people get most badly wrong, so it is worth slowing all the way down. A wet bulb temperature of 19 degrees is not 19 degrees on the thermometer on your wall. It is not a cool day. A wet bulb of 19 degrees corresponds to roughly 46 degrees Celsius, about 115 degrees Fahrenheit in dry air, or it corresponds to about 32 degrees Celsius, around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, in very humid air. In other words, that 19-degree wet bulb figure is the threshold for the most vulnerable person in the worst position, an older adult who is exerting themselves, and it lands at conditions that millions of people walk out into on an ordinary summer day without thinking twice. The reason that range stretches so wide, from 19 all the way to 32, is that the human population is not one uniform thing, and the science finally caught up to that fact. The early theoretical work imagined a single representative human. The later research, including separate studies focused specifically on older adults, found that the body's tolerance falls off sharply with age. An older person's skin sweats less, their cardiovascular system cannot ramp up blood flow to the skin as aggressively, and their sense of thirst and of heat itself can be blunted, so they neither cool as well nor always realize they are in danger. Put an older adult under any exertion at all, and their personal limit drops toward that frightening low end of the range, into conditions that look, on an ordinary thermometer, almost unremarkable. This is the quiet horror buried in that 19-degree figure, and it is why it is so important not to hear it as a mild number. 19 degrees wet bulb is not a cool day. It is the point at which the most vulnerable members of our communities, the elderly exerting themselves, the people with weakened hearts and lungs, can cross into uncompensable heat at conditions that the young and healthy around them would describe as merely a hot afternoon. It means that in the same heat wave, on the same street, two people can be having completely different experiences. For one, it is uncomfortable. For the other, the air has quietly become something their body cannot survive. The line is not in the same place for everyone, and the people for whom it sits lowest are precisely the ones least able to recognize the danger or escape it. So when scientists say the threshold is lower than we believed, they are really saying two things at once. They are saying that even the toughest among us give out sooner than the old number promised, and they are saying that for the most vulnerable among us, the line is far lower still, low enough to reach conditions that are already common in summers around the world today. The 32-degree end of the range is the other extreme, the figure closer to a fit young person at rest, the toughest case, the body best equipped to cope. So the line is not a single wall standing at one fixed temperature. It is a range, and where you personally fall inside it depends entirely on who you are and what you're doing. An old man carrying groceries up a hill is at one end. A young athlete resting in the shade is at the other. But here is what unites them, and here is what matters. The line is real. It is measurable. We can find it now in a laboratory, with a capsule and a screen and a rising curve, and it is lower than we believed. Which raises the obvious, uncomfortable question. If the line is this much closer than we thought, how many times have we already come near it? And the answer to that question contains a genuine surprise. Part 7. The catastrophes that were survivable. Here is the twist that runs through this entire story, and it is the thing that makes the whole subject so easy to misunderstand. The most lethal heat waves in modern memory, the ones with the truly staggering death tolls, the ones that rewrote national records and filled morgues and triggered government inquiries, were almost all dry events. And in this one specific chilling sense, they were survivable. They never came near the wet bulb line we have been describing. They were catastrophes, full stop. but they were catastrophes of a fundamentally different kind than the one that is now rising over the horizon. Think about how a dry heat wave is actually built. It begins with a large dome of high pressure that stalls over a region and refuses to move. Under that high, the air sinks, and as air sinks, it compresses, and as it compresses, it warms, the same way the air in a bicycle pump warms when you squeeze it. So you get this enormous lid of warming, sinking air parked over a whole country. The high pressure also clears the skies, stripping away the clouds that would have blocked the sun, and it stills the winds that would have carried heat away. Day after day, with the dome locked in place, the heat compounds. The ground bakes. The nights barely cool. The whole landscape becomes a slowly heating oven with the door held shut. In the summer of 2003, exactly that pattern settled over Europe, and it killed on the order of 70,000 people across the continent. 70,000. In Paris alone, as many as 3,400 died, many of them elderly, many of them alone in apartments in a city that had never been built for that kind of heat and had no habit of preparing for it. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern European history, and it unfolded not in a single violent moment, but as a quiet, grinding accumulation of death over weeks. 7 years later, in 2010, a similar dome settled over Russia, and it killed an estimated 55,000 people. It was the worst such disaster in that country's roughly 1,000 years of records, and the air itself turned hostile in more ways than one, thick with choking smoke as peat bogs and forests caught fire and burned across the countryside. And then, more recently, in 2021, a heat dome built over the Pacific Northwest of North America, a part of the world that thinks of itself as mild and green and cool, and it drove the small village of Lytton in British Columbia to 49.6 degrees Celsius. That is 121 degrees Fahrenheit, a national heat record for all of Canada, set in a town that the very next day was largely destroyed by fire. It is worth being precise about why those dry domes, for all their lethality, stayed below the wet bulb line, because the reason is the same, physics running in reverse. Under a dry high-pressure dome, the air is hot but parched, and parched air is desperately thirsty for moisture. So even as people suffered and died, their sweat was still evaporating, still doing some real work, still pulling some heat off the skin. The cooling system was overwhelmed and failing, but it had not been switched off entirely, the way humid air switches it off. The killing in those events came from duration and from depletion. Day after relentless day, bodies sweated out their water and their salts faster than they could be replaced. Hearts laboured without rest through nights that barely cooled, and the most fragile among the population were ground down until they failed. That distinction between death by depletion and death by the sudden shutdown of cooling is the whole reason the wet bulb story is so important and so easy to miss. The dry catastrophes are, in a grim way, the kind of heat death our species has always understood, the slow siege that medicine and shade and water and rest can fight, that a healthy person doing the right things can usually survive. The humid catastrophe is a different category. It is not a siege but a wall, the point where doing everything right, resting, hydrating, staying in the shade is no longer enough because the air itself has stopped accepting the body's heat. The famous disasters that fill the record books were sieges. The thing rising over the horizon is the wall. Each of those was a genuine catastrophe, each killed on a scale that is hard to even hold in your mind. And yet, not one of them reached the dangerous wet bulb thresholds we have been talking about. Not one of them crossed the line of compensability for healthy people. Why? Because in all of them, the air was dry. The killing was done the slow way over days, by grinding hearts and kidneys down through relentless strain, by dehydration and exhaustion, and the steady failure of bodies that were already fragile. It was lethal arithmetic, death by accumulation, falling hardest on the old and the sick and the isolated. It was not the sudden, total shutdown of the body's cooling system in a healthy adult. That worst case, the heat that can overwhelm a healthy person in a matter of hours no matter what they do, the heat that crosses the wet bulb line, was still waiting in the wings during all of those disasters. It had not yet truly arrived in a major city. The 70,000 deaths of 2003, as horrifying as they were, came from a kind of heat that humanity has, in a sense, always known. The kind that is coming is something else. And to find the one event that actually approached that line, that gave us a glimpse of the other kind of heat in a crowded modern city, You have to leave the dry record behind. You have to look at one humid city on one terrible week. Part 8. 10 Days in Karachi. In June of 2015, one of the most extreme humid heat events ever recorded settled over Karachi, the largest city in Pakistan, a sprawling coastal megacity of millions of people on the edge of the Arabian Sea. The air temperature climbed as high as 45 degrees Celsius, and that alone would have been dangerous anywhere. But Karachi sits on the coast, and unlike the dry domes that flattened Europe and Russia, this heat came wrapped in heavy moisture pulled straight off the warm sea. The humidity rode in with the heat, and so the wet bulb temperature, the number that actually matters, climbed right along with the thermometer into the territory we have spent this whole video learning to fear. Then the city's defences began to fail, one after another, in exactly the cascading pattern that frightens scientists more than almost anything else. It is one thing for the heat to be extreme. It is another for every safety net to tear at the same moment, and that is precisely what happened. First, the electrical grid buckled under the demand as millions of people reached for whatever cooling they had, and the power went out across much of the city. And the instant the power failed, the disaster multiplied, because so many of the other lifelines depended on it. With the power gone, the pumps that moved the city's water stopped working, and water itself grew scarce in the middle of a heat emergency at the exact moment people needed it most desperately. And layered on top of all of this was the calendar. It was the month of Ramadan, and many of Karachi's residents were observing the fast, which meant they were not eating or drinking during daylight hours. During the very hours the heat was at its absolute worst, a huge portion of the population was, by deep and sincere religious observance, not drinking water at all. Every single layer of protection that a person might normally lean on, electricity, water, hydration, came away in their hands at once. The result was staggering. In roughly 10 days, at least 1,200 people died, most of them from heat stroke and dehydration, and many researchers consider even that figure an undercount. The hospitals were overwhelmed almost instantly. Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Centre, one of the city's largest, alone treated thousands of heat patients in a matter of days, the corridors filling with the collapsing and the dying faster than the staff could possibly keep up. And then came the image that, more than any statistic, tells the whole story of what humid heat at the limit actually means. The Eddy Foundation, a beloved charity, runs the largest morgue in Karachi, and during those 10 days that morgue ran out of room. After taking in around 650 bodies, its cold storage was completely full, and so the dead were left outside, in the very heat that had killed them, while families moved among the rows searching for the faces of the people they had lost. A morgue, the one place built to hold the dead with dignity, defeated by the sheer number of them, in a modern city in our own time. Later, when scientists went back and reconstructed the conditions of those 10 days, they found something that turns Karachi from a tragedy into a warning. The Karachi event had crossed the uncompensable wet bulb threshold for older adults for something like 8 to 10% of its duration. Let that land. For roughly a tenth of those 10 days, for the city's most vulnerable people, the air itself had become something that a human body sitting still, doing nothing wrong, simply could not survive. Not because of poverty, not because of a failed grid, not because of any human mistake, but because of the raw physics of the atmosphere outside. The line had been crossed in a real city for real people, in our lifetimes. It is worth dwelling on the social shape of the Karachi disaster, because it repeats, with eerie consistency, in heat catastrophe after heat catastrophe, and it tells us something about who dies and why. The heat itself was the trigger, but the death toll was sculpted by vulnerability. The people who died in the greatest numbers were the poor, who had no cooling and could not leave their work. They were the elderly, especially those living alone with no one to notice they were in trouble. They were labourers who could not afford to stop, and the sick whose bodies had no reserve to spend. The wet bulb physics set the stage, but the cast of victims was chosen by who had the least protection. We have seen this exact pattern before in places far from Pakistan, when a heat disaster struck the American city of Chicago in the summer of 1995. The people who died were overwhelmingly the isolated elderly, alone in apartments, afraid to open their windows, with no one checking on them, in neighbourhoods where social connection had frayed. When the Great Dome settled over Paris in 2003, a huge share of the dead were older people living alone, many of them in top-floor apartments that turned into ovens, while much of the country was away on the August holidays. Across continents and decades, the same grim signature appears. Heat finds the people who have been left alone, the people no one comes to check on, the people the rest of us have, in some quiet way, already stopped seeing. That pattern is a warning, but it is also, hidden inside it, a kind of hope, and we will come back to it. Because if a large share of heat deaths are deaths of isolation and neglect rather than deaths of pure unsurvivable physics, then a large share of them can be prevented by the simple, unglamorous act of paying attention. Karachi crossed the true wet bulb line for a sliver of its duration, and during that sliver the physics alone was lethal regardless of anything anyone did. But the vast majority of the 1,200 who died in the longer stretches where survival was still possible, where what failed was not the human body's last physical limit, but the web of protection that should have surrounded the most vulnerable and did not. That had almost never happened before in a major population centre. And here is the thing that keeps the scientists who study this awake at night. Their fear is not really that Karachi happened. Their fear is that the precise combination of conditions that produced Karachi, the heat, the coastal moisture, the saturated air driving the wet bulb temperature up to the edge of survivability, is exactly the combination that our warming world is now manufacturing faster than any other. What makes Karachi such a useful and terrible teacher is that it shows the whole sequence in one place, compressed into 10 days. It shows the heat and the moisture combining to drive the wet bulb temperature toward the line. It shows the infrastructure, the grid and the water, failing at the worst possible moment and stripping away the defences people thought they had. It shows the social pattern, the poor and the old and the labouring dying first. And it shows the institutions, right down to the morgue, being overwhelmed by a scale of death they were never built to handle. Every element of the larger crisis that the maps project for the coming decades was present in that single city, in that single week, in miniature. It was a controlled demonstration that no one controlled, a glimpse of the mechanism running to completion in a real place full of real people. Karachi was not a freak. Karachi was a preview. And to understand why it is a preview rather than a one-off, you have to understand one clean, unbreakable line of physics, the engine quietly driving this entire problem. Part 9. The Hidden Climb. The reason humid heat is the rising danger, rather than just one flavour of heat among many, comes down to a single line of physics so simple and so reliable that it has its own name in the textbooks. Warmer air holds more water vapour. Specifically, for every 1 degree Celsius that the air warms, it can hold roughly 7% more water. That is the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship, and it is not a projection or a model or a contested theory. It is a basic property of water and air, as dependable as the freezing point of water, true in a laboratory and true in the atmosphere over your head right now. Think about what that means for a warming planet. As the world heats up, the atmosphere does not just get hotter, it gets thirstier, and then it gets wetter, because it can hold more moisture, and over any warm ocean or wet landscape, it does. So in any place that has a source of water nearby, and that is most of the places people actually live, a warm ocean, a great river, a coastal delta, fields of irrigated crops sweating moisture into the air, rising temperatures tend to drag the humidity up right along with them. The heat and the water rise together hand in hand, and when humidity rises alongside the heat, the wet bulb temperature, the number that decides whether your body can shed its warmth, climbs faster than the ordinary thermometer alone would ever tell you. This is the trap, and it is a quiet one, because it hides inside numbers that look familiar. A region can look at its forecast highs and feel that it is coping. It can tell itself that yes, it is hot, but these are numbers we have always lived with, numbers our grandparents lived with, nothing we cannot handle. And on the ordinary thermometer, that might even be true. The air temperature might be only a degree or two above what that place has historically seen. But underneath that reassuring headline figure, pulled steadily upward by all the extra moisture that a warmer world has loaded into the air, the wet bulb temperature is rising faster. The number nobody is reading is climbing toward the line, while the number everybody watches stays just familiar enough to keep them calm. That gap between the headline heat that feels survivable and the wet bulb heat that quietly is not, is the whole danger in a single idea. It is why a place can be far closer to the limit than it feels. It is why the warning signs do not show up where people are looking. The dry catastrophes of the past, the 2003 Europe disaster, the 2010 Russia disaster, were the kind of heat humanity has always known and always feared, the visible kind, the kind with the big, obvious number. The heat that is coming is a different animal entirely. It is being bred in exactly the warm, wet, crowded places where the most people live, and it announces itself in a measurement that almost no one is taught to watch. To see why this engine is so relentless, follow where the extra moisture actually comes from, because it is not distributed evenly across the world. It comes, above all, from the oceans, which cover most of the planet and which have been quietly absorbing the overwhelming majority of the extra heat that human activity has trapped. A warmer ocean evaporates more water into the air above it, and that warm, wet air gets carried inland by the winds, especially in the great coastal regions and river deltas where so much of humanity has always chosen to live, because those places were fertile and reachable and rich with water. The very geography that made these places ideal for human civilization, the warm coasts and the broad deltas and the irrigated plains, is the geography that now loads the air with the moisture that drives the wet bulb temperature toward the line. This is why the danger map of the future is not the danger map you would draw from the air temperature alone. The hottest air temperatures on Earth occur in the great deserts, in places that are largely empty precisely because they are so harsh. But the deserts are dry, so their wet bulb temperatures stay manageable even at staggering air temperatures. The places where the wet bulb threat concentrates are different. They are the warm and the wet and the populous, the coastal plains of South Asia, the lands around the Persian Gulf, the river valleys and the humid subtropics, and yes, the warm, moist eastern half of a certain large country where many of you are watching from. The threat does not aim itself at the empty quarters of the world. It aims with a kind of terrible precision at exactly the places where people gathered, settled, and built. There is a feedback hidden in here too, one that makes the trap tighter. The irrigated agriculture that feeds billions of people pumps enormous quantities of water into the air through the crops and the soil, cooling the ground a little but raising the humidity a lot. So in some of the most densely farmed and densely populated regions on Earth, the very act of growing the food that sustains the population helps load the local air with the moisture that pushes the wet bulb temperature higher during a heat wave. The systems that keep people alive and the systems that endanger them are in these places tangled together in ways that make simple solutions hard to find. So we have the engine, the simple physics that loads more and more moisture into a warming sky. We have the line, lower than we thought, mapped now in laboratories with capsules and rising curves. And we have the one real city, Karachi, that has already touched that line and shown us what it does. The obvious next question is the one that turns this from a story about the past into a story about your future. If you take that measured human limit and you lay it across a map of the warming world that we are actually heading into, where does the line fall? Which places cross it? And when? And the answer is the part of this that stopped being abstract for me, because of where, exactly, the danger lands. Part 10. When you lay the line on the map. When researchers take that measured human limit, the line they found in the chambers, and lay it across maps of a warming world, the whole subject stops being abstract. It stops being a laboratory curiosity and becomes a kind of forecast, a picture of which parts of the planet cross into danger, and when, and for how long. And the picture is not what most people in the wealthy world imagine when they think about the victims of extreme heat. Start with 2 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. 2 degrees is the number that has been argued over in climate negotiations for decades, the threshold the world has been trying and largely failing to stay under. On our current path, 2 degrees of warming could arrive in as little as 2 decades. That is not a distant science fiction date. That is within the lifetime of nearly everyone watching this, within the working lives of today's young adults, within the childhood of kids who are alive right now. At 2 degrees of warming, dangerous, uncompensable conditions for older adults would spread to cover roughly a third of the planet's land area, about 35% of all the land on Earth. And here is why that number is so much worse than it sounds. That land is not empty. It is not 35% of howling desert and frozen waste. It is, overwhelmingly, where people are. The regions that cross into that danger zone at 2 degrees include most of India, a country of well over 1 billion people. They include most of the populated parts of China, the other great population centre of the planet. And, in the part that should land hardest for many of the people watching this, they include most of the eastern portion of the United States, the warm, humid half of the country east of the plains, where the great majority of Americans actually live. This is not a threat aimed at distant strangers in faraway lands. It is aimed quite specifically at home. That same 2 degrees of warming would also roughly triple the land area where even younger, healthy adults, the toughest, most heat-resistant people we have, face uncompensable conditions. Remember, the young and fit sit at the far protected end of that survivability range. For their danger zone to triple in size is a measure of how fast the protected end of the spectrum is shrinking. The margin that used to belong only to the most vulnerable is now reaching for the strongest among us too. And if warming is allowed to run further, to 4 degrees, or if the climate proves more sensitive than we are hoping, the picture darkens past anything in human experience. At 4 degrees, more than 60% of the Earth's land surface could cross into those dangerous wet bulb conditions for older adults. More than half the land on the planet. And some regions would not face that danger as an occasional summer emergency. They would face it almost continuously, as a near-permanent feature of the climate, a recurring season of air that the most vulnerable bodies simply cannot survive without artificial cooling every single year. Take a breath here, because it is easy to let numbers like 60% slide past as just another statistic. What that figure actually describes is a planet on which the majority of the land is, for part of every year, hostile to unprotected human life in a way that has essentially never been true before in the entire span of our species. Human beings spread across this world, every continent, every climate, by adapting, by sweating, by enduring. The wet bulb line is the one wall that adaptation and endurance cannot climb, because it is not about toughness or acclimatization or willpower. It is about physics, and the physics does not negotiate. It helps to make those abstract percentages concrete by looking at the specific places, because 1/3 of the world's land is too large a thing to feel. Begin with South Asia, with the vast plains of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, home to well over 1.5 billion people between them. These are flat, low-lying, intensely farmed and intensely crowded lands, fed by the monsoon and laced with rivers, and they sit at latitudes that are already brutally hot. They are, in the language of this video, the warm, the wet, and the populous all at maximum. The studies that map the wet bulb future consistently put South Asia near the very front of the line, among the first great population centres where dangerous, uncompensable conditions become a recurring feature of the summer rather than a rare shock. When researchers talk about the wet bulb threat, this is very often the region weighing most heavily on their minds, because the sheer number of exposed people is almost beyond comprehension. Then there is the region around the Persian Gulf, where the combination of searing air temperatures and a hot, shallow, evaporating sea has already produced some of the highest wet bulb readings ever measured anywhere on the planet. These are places that have, on isolated occasions, briefly touched conditions near the theoretical limit, glimpses of a future arriving early. For now those moments are rare and brief, confined to the hottest hours of the worst days, but they are proof that the conditions are not hypothetical. They have occurred. They have been recorded by instruments. The line is not purely a thing of models and projections. It has, in a few places, for a few hours, already been brushed. And then there is home, for so many of you watching. The warm, humid eastern half of the United States, everything from the Gulf Coast up through the Mississippi Valley and across the southeast and into the crowded corridors of the east, is exactly the kind of moisture-rich, densely populated land that the wet bulb maps shade in as warming proceeds. This is not a threat that politely confines itself to distant countries that are easy to look away from. The same maps that put the danger over Karachi and the plains of India put a version of it, milder for now but growing, over the places where most Americans live and work and raise their children. That is the detail that turns this from a documentary about elsewhere into a story about the air outside your own door. That is the map of where the line falls, but a map only shows you the where, it does not show you the how often. And when you look at how the frequency of these events changes in a warming world, the picture turns from a geography of danger into something that feels much more like a clock running down. Part 11. When the exception becomes the rule. It is not just the map that changes as the world warms, it is the calendar. The frequency of these events, how often they come around, shifts in a way that quietly transforms the whole nature of the threat, turning rare catastrophes into regular features of life. Remember the 2003 heatwave that killed as many as 3,400 people in Paris alone? The kind of disaster that, historically, comes along about once a century. A grandparent might live their whole life and see one. It was treated rightly as a generational catastrophe, the sort of thing that shocks a nation precisely because it is so rare. Now consider what the science projects for that same severity of event at 2 degrees of warming. Scientists expect that Paris will face heat waves of that magnitude not once a century, but once every few years. The 100-year disaster becomes the few-year disaster. The thing that was supposed to happen once in a lifetime starts happening again and again, often enough that a single decade could hold several of them. When a once-in-a-century event starts arriving every few years, something breaks in the way a society can respond to it. The whole machinery of disaster, the emergency plans, the hospital surge capacity, the public memory, the simple ability to recover in between, is built around rarity. It assumes there will be long gaps to rebuild and forget and prepare. Take away the gaps, stack the catastrophes close together, and the system never gets to reset. Each event lands on a population still exhausted from the last one, on infrastructure never fully repaired, on a public that has not had time to recover. Rarity is not just a statistic. Rarity is part of how we survive these things at all, and warming is taking the rarity away. Now apply the same logic to the humid events, the ones that actually touch the wet bulb line. Karachi in 2015 crossed the older adult threshold for a sliver of its duration, that 8 to 10% of those 10 days. That was already almost unprecedented. But run the climate forward. At 2 degrees of warming, an event like Karachi would cross that line not just for older adults but for younger, healthy adults as well, the fit and the strong included in the danger, not just the frail. And at 4 degrees of warming, an event of that kind would cross the older adult threshold for roughly 90% of its duration. Not 8 to 10%, 90%. Almost the entire length of the event spent in conditions that the most vulnerable bodies cannot survive. There is something almost vertiginous about watching a threshold move like this, because we are used to thinking of survival limits as fixed walls, permanent features of the world. The freezing point of water does not drift. The altitude at which the air grows too thin to breathe does not creep downward year by year. But the wet bulb danger is different. Not because human physiology is changing, but because the climate that human physiology has to cope with is changing underneath it. The limit of the body stays where it has always been. It is the world that is rising to meet it, and rising faster in the humid places, so that the same fixed human ceiling is breached more and more often as the air beneath it warms and moistens. We are not getting weaker. The conditions are getting stronger, and they are doing it on a timescale measured not in geological ages, but in decades, within the span of a single human life. And that timescale is the part that should command attention, because it collapses the comfortable distance we like to keep from problems labelled climate. 2 degrees of warming, the threshold where a third of the world's land turns dangerous for older adults, is not a number for the year 2200. On the current path it could arrive within a couple of decades, which means the people who will live in that world are not some distant unborn generation. They are us and our children, and the young adults watching this right now who will simply be in middle age when it happens. The maps of the wet bulb future are not portraits of a science fiction planet. They are increasingly travel advisories for the second half of lives already underway. That is the trajectory in a single comparison. The thing that happened for a sliver of one terrible event, once, in a way that shocked the scientists who found it, is on a path to become the steady state of such events, the default rather than the exception. The exception, in other words, is on its way to becoming the rule. The wet bulb crossing that had almost never happened before in a major city becomes, in a hot enough world, simply what a bad heatwave is. Think about what the loss of rarity does to a place over a human lifetime, because this is where the statistics turn into lived experience. A child born today into one of these regions would not grow up with the heatwave as a once-in-a-lifetime story told by grandparents. They would grow up with it as a recurring season, a thing that comes around again and again, that they learn to dread the way earlier generations learned to dread a hard winter. The disaster stops being an event that happens to a society and becomes a condition that a society lives inside, and societies are not built for that. Our institutions, our insurance, our infrastructure, our very sense of what is normal are all calibrated to a world in which the worst heat is rare, Remove the rarity and you do not just multiply the deaths. You change what kind of place a region is, what can be grown there, who can work outdoors, whether the power can be kept on, whether people stay or leave. There is a particular trap hidden in this acceleration, and it has to do with memory and money. After a great disaster, there is usually a wave of resolve. Plans are drawn up, defences are funded, lessons are learned. But that resolve fades with time, and it fades fastest when the gaps between disasters are long, because people forget, budgets get cut, and the next generation does not carry the fear. The cruel thing about the few-year disaster is that it lands too often to recover from, and yet, perversely, can still be treated as a surprise each time, because each event arrives before the last one has been fully reckoned with, and the response never quite catches up to the new frequency. The pace of the threat outruns the pace of our adaptation, and the gap between them is measured in lives. And this is the point where the whole subject stops being a forecast about some abstract future and becomes something you can actually watch happening. Because the line is not waiting politely for 2 degrees, or for 4. The conditions that push toward it are assembling now, in the climate we already have, in real cities, in real time. As this is being told, it is the summer of 2026, and the line is being tested in front of us. So let us go back to where we started, back to those falling records, and look at them again, this time knowing what they actually mean. Part 12. The records read correctly. This is no longer a thing the world is waiting for. As this is being told, it is the summer of 2026, and the line we have spent this whole time describing is being tested in real time, across 2 continents at once. Go back now to those records from the very beginning, the ones that sounded at first like just another run of hot weather headlines. Read them again, knowing what you now know, and they change character completely. A severe heat wave has gripped Western Europe, and a second, more intense wave built in around the 17th of June, in the final days before the solstice. The records began to fall like dominoes. France recorded its hottest day ever measured. Paris hit a June record of 40.9 degrees Celsius, about 106 degrees Fahrenheit. In Spain, the town of Estación, in Cantabria, logged 43.7 degrees on the 23rd of June, and the country posted its highest daily average temperature since 1950. The United Kingdom broke its own June record, and national records gave way across Belgium, Germany, Ireland, Italy and the Netherlands, a whole continent's worth of all-time and seasonal marks falling inside a single span of days. For most of the coverage, that is where the story stops. The numbers, the records, the maps glowing red. But you understand now that the air temperature is only half of the equation, and not even the more important half. Much of Western Europe is not desert. It has the Mediterranean to its south, the Atlantic to its west, moisture available to ride in with the heat. And so, beneath those record-breaking thermometer readings, the wet bulb temperature has been climbing too, the real measure of danger rising underneath the one that makes the headlines. And then there are the deaths, which are where the abstraction ends and the physics becomes flesh. In France alone, at least 18 people have died in this heat. And look closely at who they were, because the science we have just walked through predicted them with terrible precision. Among the dead were 2 children and 3 elderly people, the 2 ends of the age range, the infants whose bodies cannot regulate heat well and who cannot help themselves, and the older adults whose cooling systems have weakened and whose hearts and lungs are already strained. These are not random victims, these are exactly the people that the chamber studies and the threshold research had already marked in advance as the first to fall when heat outpaces the body's ability to shed it. They did not die from an abstraction in a journal. They died from the precise mechanism this entire video has been describing, in the exact week it is being told. And dozens more died in a way that is easy to file under accident, but that belongs to this same story. They drowned. Dozens of people across the heat-struck regions lost their lives reaching for any cool water they could find, in rivers, in lakes, in quarries and canals. When the air becomes unbearable and there is no other relief, people go to the water and some of them do not come back out. That too is a heat death. It just gets written on a different line of the ledger, the same way heat deaths so often get written down as heart attacks and strokes. The true cost of a heat wave is always larger and always more hidden than the official heat toll suggests. It is worth noticing how the European events and the science we have walked through fit together with almost uncomfortable precision, because this is the test of any theory. whether it predicts what actually happens. The research told us, in advance, several specific things. It told us that the very young and the very old would fall first. It told us that the danger would be worst where heat met moisture. It told us that the warm nights would do much of the killing, and that many heat deaths would be hidden under other names, including accidents like drowning as people fled to the water. And then June of 2026 arrived and delivered exactly that pattern. The dead in France were the children and the elderly. The relief seekers drowned. The records fell across a continent with moisture available to drive the wet bulb temperature up beneath them. The science did not just describe some far-off possibility. It wrote the script that this summer is now performing. That is what makes this moment different from the abstract warnings of years past. For a long time, the wet bulb threat lived in the future tense, a thing the model said was coming, easy to file away as tomorrow's problem. What the events of this summer demonstrate is that the mechanism is no longer waiting. It is operating now, in the present tense, in famous cities on 2 continents, killing the exact people the research marked as most exposed, in the exact conditions it warned about. The future the scientists described did not announce itself with something unrecognizable. It announced itself with a heat wave that, on the surface, looked like all the others, until you knew what to look for underneath. So when you hear that France recorded its hottest day in history, or that record after record fell across Europe, understand what is actually being reported. It is not a weather curiosity. It is the line being approached in real cities with real bodies, and the most vulnerable among us being the first to cross it. The records on the thermometers are the visible surface of something deeper. And the people who died this week, the children and the elderly of France, are the proof that the gap between the headline number and the human limit is not theoretical. It is the distance between a hot afternoon and a funeral. But Europe is only half of what is happening this summer. Because at the very same moment on the other side of the Atlantic, a different face of the same threat has been building over the United States. And it carries a warning hidden not in the daytime highs, but in the one number that comes after dark. Part 13. The Night That Will Not Cool. At the same moment that Europe's records were falling, a heat dome built over the central and eastern United States, forecast to be the most widespread heat wave of the American summer, the pattern was the now familiar one, an enormous ridge of high pressure anchored over the eastern half of the country, sinking and warming the air beneath it and locking the heat in place. Forecasters described it in unusually blunt language, the national guidance calling it a significant, dangerous and record-breaking heat wave for the central to eastern United States, with the worst of it building toward the end of the week and rolling straight into the Independence Day weekend, when tens of millions of people would be outdoors. The daytime numbers were severe enough on their own. Heat index values, the combination of heat and humidity that approximates how the air actually feels and acts on the body, were forecast to climb past 105 degrees Fahrenheit across the south and toward 110 in many places, from the Midwest and the Mississippi Valley all the way to the East Coast. Multiple weather offices warned that all-time record high temperatures, not just daily records but the hottest readings ever recorded at some locations, could be challenged in the heart of the event. By the 29th of June, the country was already under a thick layer of official alarm, with dozens of extreme heat warnings and watches and heat advisories stacked across the map. But the truly telling number in the American forecast was not the afternoon high. It was the one that comes after dark. Overnight, the low temperatures were forecast to stay so high, in many places refusing to fall out of the upper 70s or even the low 80s Fahrenheit, that records for warm nighttime minimums were in play across the Midwest and the East. And that, the night that will not cool, is the silent multiplier hidden inside every great heat disaster, the factor that turns a dangerous heat wave into a deadly one. Here is why the night matters so much and why scientists watch the overnight lows even more closely than the daytime highs. During a hot day, your body takes on a heat load, a kind of thermal debt, and it leans on the cooler hours of the night to pay that debt back down, to recover, to reset before the next day's assault begins. The night is the body's repair window. It is when the strained heart gets to rest, when the core temperature settles back toward normal, when a person can finally sleep and recover. When the temperature never falls far enough at night, that window slams shut. The body never gets to pay down the debt, so the strain from one day carries straight into the next and then the next, accumulating, compounding, with no relief in between. The heat load just keeps stacking day after day, night after night, until fragile bodies that could have survived any single day of it are pushed past their limit by the relentlessness of it. This is exactly the mechanism that turned heat waves in places like Chicago and the Pacific Northwest into mass casualty events. It was not only how hot the afternoons got, it was that the nights gave no mercy. The same warm, humid air that drives the wet bulb temperature up during the day is the air that refuses to cool at night, because that moisture acts like a blanket, trapping the day's heat near the ground long after the sun has gone down. The humidity that defeats your sweat in the afternoon is the same humidity that steals your recovery in the dark. They are two faces of the same threat, and the warm night is the one that does the quiet, cumulative killing. There is a particular cruelty to the warm night that deserves to be spelled out, because it overturns the comforting assumption that the danger ends when the sun goes down. We instinctively treat nightfall as relief, as the moment the threat passes and we can finally rest. For most of human history that instinct was correct, because nights almost always cooled enough to let bodies recover. But humid heat breaks that ancient bargain. The same blanket of moisture that defeats your sweat by day holds the day's heat near the ground by night, and so the temperature stalls hour after hour in the high 70s or low 80s, and the relief simply never comes. People go to bed believing the worst is behind them, and the heat keeps working on them in the dark, in their sleep, when no one is watching and no one thinks to check. This is why the overnight low is, to the people who study heat mortality, often a better predictor of how many will die than the daytime high. A region can survive a ferocious afternoon if the night that follows lets its people cool down and reset. But string together several days where the nights never release their grip, and the death toll climbs even if the afternoon peaks were not records at all. The bodies most at risk, the elderly, the sick, the very young, depend utterly on that nighttime recovery window, and when it closes, their margin of survival closes with it. The forecast of nights that will not cool across the American Midwest and East is, read correctly, not a footnote to the heat wave. It is the part of the forecast that the people who count the dead will be watching most closely of all. So look at this American heat dome the way you now look at the European records, with the second number in mind. The daytime heat indices toward 110 tell you the air is dangerous. The overnight lows in the upper 70s and low 80s tell you it will stay dangerous around the clock, that there will be no repair window, that the debt will keep stacking. Across two continents, in the same few weeks, the same physics is being demonstrated. In Europe, in the bodies of the children and the elderly who have already died. In America, in the forecast of nights that will not let the country cool down. The exact thing this video has been describing is not a future scenario, it is the weather report right now. Which raises the question that everyone, watching the records fall and the warnings stack up, eventually arrives at. If the air outside is reaching the edge of what a body can survive, then surely the answer is simple. Surely the answer is to go inside, close the windows, and turn on the air conditioning. And air conditioning genuinely is the single most important tool we have. But it is also a trap, and it is a trap with exactly 4 walls. Part 14, The Trap with 4 Walls. If the only way to survive uncompensable heat is to cool the environment around you, then the obvious answer, the one almost everyone reaches for, is air conditioning. And let me be completely clear about this, because it matters. Air conditioning is genuinely the single most important tool we have for surviving the heat that is coming. It saves lives, in enormous numbers, every single summer. Nothing that follows is an argument against it, but air conditioning is also a trap, and to understand why our situation is so difficult, you have to understand the 4 walls of that trap, because each one closes off an escape that, at first glance, looks wide open. The first wall is cost. Air conditioning is expensive both to buy and, more importantly, to run, because it is hungry for energy, and energy costs money every hour the unit is on. And here is the cruel arithmetic of it. The people most exposed to deadly heat are very often the very same people least able to afford to run the cooling that would save them. This is true inside wealthy nations, where an elderly person on a fixed income may own an air conditioner and still ration it, or never turn it on at all, because they are terrified of the electricity bill. And it is true across the poorer, hotter parts of the world, the regions where the wet bulb danger is highest of all, where vast numbers of people have no air conditioning whatsoever, and no realistic prospect of getting it. The defense exists, but it is handed out in inverse proportion to the need. The ones who need it most can least afford it, and the ones who can afford it freely often need it least. The second wall is subtler, and it is a matter of physics rather than economics. Air conditioning does not destroy heat. It cannot. It can only move heat from one place to another. When you cool the inside of a building, you're not making that heat disappear, you are pumping it out of the building and into the air outside, which is exactly why the back of an air conditioning unit blows hot. So in a dense city, where you have countless units all running at once on the hottest day, all of them dumping their indoor heat out into the streets at the same time, the collective effect is to make the outdoors hotter still. This feeds something called the urban heat island, the well-documented effect by which cities run significantly hotter than the surrounding countryside, especially at night. So the very act of everyone cooling their own interiors helps heat the shared outdoor air that everyone else, the people on the street, the people without cooling, still have to breathe and move through. The individual escape makes the collective problem worse. The third wall is the grid, and it may be the most frightening of the four because it can fail all at once. Even if everyone could afford a unit, the electrical power system was simply never built for every household in a region to run cooling at full blast on the same afternoon. And the single most stressful moment for an electrical grid, the moment it is most likely to be pushed past its limits, is precisely the hottest day of the year, which is precisely the day that every air conditioner in the region is straining at maximum, which is precisely the day that people need that power most desperately to survive. The demand peaks at the exact moment the danger peaks, and if cooling is the only thing standing between vulnerable people and uncompensable heat, then the instant the power fails, from an overloaded grid or from a storm tearing down the lines, every one of those people is immediately, instantly at risk. We saw this exact cascade in Karachi. The grid failed first, and everything else followed. And that points to the compounding disaster that scientists fear most of all, the nightmare scenario that lives at the intersection of these threats. Imagine a powerful tropical cyclone that knocks out the power across a wide region, tearing down lines, flooding substations, leaving millions in the dark. And then, in the days that follow, while the grid is still down and cannot be restored, a humid heat wave moves in behind the storm. Now you have a population with no power, in saturated, dangerous air, with no way left to cool anyone, in exactly the conditions that approach the wet bulb line. The storm and the heat, arriving back to back, each making the other deadlier. That is not a far-fetched scenario. It is a combination that a warming world makes more likely on both ends, stronger storms and more frequent humid heat. And it is the kind of compound event that keeps emergency planners awake at night. The fourth wall is the one that closes the loop, and it is the most insidious of all, because it means the cure is feeding the disease. The more the world leans on air conditioning to survive the heat, the more energy it demands, and as long as that energy comes from burning fossil fuels, the more it feeds the very warming that is driving the heat in the first place. Cooling already accounts for around 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that share is climbing fast. The International Energy Agency projects that the number of air conditioning units worldwide will nearly triple by the year 2050, as billions of people in warming, developing nations reasonably and understandably reach for the same relief that the wealthy world has long taken for granted. Left unaddressed, that means a vast new surge of energy demand, and if it is met by burning carbon, the cure accelerates the disease in a self-reinforcing spiral. We cool ourselves, which warms the world, which makes us need to cool ourselves more. Stand back from those four walls and you can see the shape of the bind we're in, because it is not the kind of problem that yields to individual effort alone. A person can buy an air conditioner, but they cannot single-handedly decarbonize the grid that powers it, cannot keep the power from failing on the hottest day, cannot stop the collective heat of 1 million units from warming the street they share, cannot, by their own thrift, make cooling affordable for the neighbour across town who is going without. Every one of the four walls is a collective problem wearing the disguise of a personal one. And that disguise is dangerous because it tempts us to believe that survival is simply a matter of personal preparation, that the responsible individual will be fine, when in truth the thing that determines who lives through the heat that is coming is built at the scale of cities and grids and nations, not living rooms. There is a global dimension to this that is easy to miss from inside a wealthy country, and it is a matter of basic fairness as much as physics. the regions where the wet bulb danger is highest, the hot and humid and crowded parts of the developing world, are overwhelmingly the regions that did the least to cause the warming in the first place, and that can least afford the cooling that would protect them from it. The people most exposed to the deadliest heat on Earth are very often the people who burn the least carbon and hold the fewest resources to defend themselves. So when we talk about air conditioning as a defence, we have to be honest that it is a defence distributed by wealth, reaching the people who contributed most to the problem and bypassing many of the people suffering its sharpest edge. The four walls, in other words, do not press equally on everyone. They press hardest exactly where the heat does. Those are the four walls. Cost, that hands the defence to those who need it least. Displacement, that makes the shared air hotter even as we cool our own rooms. The grid, that is most likely to fail at the exact moment it is most needed. And the feedback loop in which the cure feeds the disease. Air conditioning is essential, and we cannot do without it. But it is not an escape from the problem. It is a tool that, used the way we're using it now, can quietly make the larger trap tighter, which is why the real answers, the ones that might actually keep people on the right side of the line, have to be bigger than any single machine in any single window. Part 15. What they are actually not telling you. By now you can feel the shape of the thing, and you can feel how strange it is that so little of this reaches ordinary conversation. We talk constantly about the heat. We share the maps glowing red. We marvel at the records. We compare how hot it got where we live. And yet the one number that actually decides survival, the wet bulb temperature, almost never comes up. The line that is lower than we thought and rising faster than the headlines, the maps showing it reaching into the eastern United States, the children and the elderly already dying from exactly the mechanism the science predicted, all of it sits just slightly out of frame in the way the heat usually gets discussed. So it is worth asking, plainly, what they are actually not telling you about the extreme heat hitting the planet right now. And here we have to be careful and honest, because there is a whole world of theories out there that claim to have the hidden answer, and most of them lead in exactly the wrong direction. When people sense that something is being left out of the official story, and something genuinely is being left out, some of them reach for the idea that the heat itself is being manufactured, that it is being engineered deliberately through programs like the High Frequency Research Facility, often referred to by its initials, or through what is loosely called weather modification, or through cloud seeding. The intuition underneath these theories is not crazy. It is the correct instinct that we are not being told the whole story, attached to the wrong explanation. So let us take it seriously and look at the actual numbers, because that is the honest thing to do. The facility that gets blamed most often operates at the scale of a few megawatts of power. A few megawatts. The energy embodied in a single continental heat dome, the kind sprawling over Europe or the eastern United States right now, is larger than that by many, many orders of magnitude. It is not a close call. It is not even in the same universe of scale. Trying to steer a continental heat dome with a few megawatts is like trying to redirect a hurricane by blowing on it. The energy simply is not there, by a factor so enormous that the comparison becomes almost meaningless. As for cloud seeding, it is a real technology, but a humble one. On its best day, it can coax a modest amount of extra precipitation out of clouds that already exist and are already primed to rain. It cannot conjure a clear, sinking, continent-sized ridge of high pressure out of nothing. It cannot manufacture a heat dome any more than a single bucket of water can fill a reservoir. Then there is the claim that the temperature records themselves are fake, that they are artifacts of badly placed thermometers or outright fabrications. But the records do not come from one thermometer or one agency or one country. They come from thousands of independent stations, run by different nations with different governments and no shared motive, many of them recording continuously for a century or more, and they all tell the same consistent story. When France, Spain, Britain, Belgium, Germany, Ireland, Italy and the Netherlands all break records in the same span of days, measured by separate national agencies on separate equipment, the idea that it is coordinated fabrication collapses under its own weight, and the claim that it is simply the sun, some surge in solar output cooking us, runs aground on the basic fact that these events are driven by the circulation of the lower atmosphere, by stalled ridges and a contorted jet stream, on top of an elevated baseline, not by any measured spike in the sunlight reaching the ground. The sun has been quietly going about its business while the lower atmosphere does this to us. It is worth asking honestly why a story this important travels so poorly, why it slips out of frame even in serious coverage of the heat. Part of the answer is that the wet bulb temperature is genuinely harder to explain than a record high, and it resists the quick, punchy segment. A record is a clean headline. A second hidden temperature that measures whether your body can cool itself, that has to be carefully distinguished from the number on the thermometer, that lands differently for the young and the old, simply takes longer to tell, and attention is short. Part of the answer is that the truth here offers no villain, no secret program, no single bad actor to point at, only physics and chemistry and the slow accumulation of choices, and a story without a villain is a harder story to sell. And part of it, frankly, is that the conclusion is frightening in a way that does not resolve neatly, that asks something of us rather than letting us simply watch and move on. So here is the honest conclusion. The thing that is being left out of the story is not a conspiracy. It is something stranger and, in its way, more unsettling, because there is no villain to blame and no secret program to expose. What they are not telling you is the science itself, the wet bulb temperature, the limit of compensability that turned out to be lower than we believed, the maps that put the danger zone over the places where most people live, including much of the country most of you are watching from. The fact that the headline number, the one we all watch, is the wrong number and the right number is climbing faster, underneath, where almost no one is looking. The genuine hidden story is not that someone is making the heat. It is that the heat we are already making, through the ordinary, unglamorous, well-understood process of warming the planet, is approaching a line in human physiology that we have only recently learned how to measure, and that is closer than we were told. The truth that is being underplayed is not exotic, it is just frightening, and it does not fit neatly into a 30-second segment so it slips out of frame. That is a quieter kind of not telling you, but it is the one that actually matters. Part 16. Territory no one has lived in. Step back for a moment and look at where all of this leaves us, because the sum of it is genuinely something new under the sun. We are walking into territory that no human society has ever lived in before, not a hotter version of a place we know, not a rougher edition of summers our grandparents endured, but a genuinely new physical regime, one that our entire history offers no instruction manual for. And the reason it is new is the thing we keep coming back to, because it is the hinge of the whole story. There is a measurable physical limit to what a human body can take. It sits lower than we used to believe, and the most crowded regions on Earth, including much of the United States, are moving toward it inside the lifetimes of people who are alive today. It is worth being precise about why this limit is different from every other hardship our species has overcome, because humans are justifiably proud of our adaptability. We are the animal that spread to every continent, that survived ice ages and droughts and famines, that learned to live in deserts and on frozen tundra, and at altitudes where the air runs thin. Our whole story is a story of enduring, of toughening, of figuring it out, and so the natural assumption is that we will simply adapt to this too, the way we have adapted to everything else. We will acclimatise, we will get tougher, we will build our way through. But the wet bulb line does not yield to any of that, and this is the part that is so hard to accept, because it runs against the deepest instinct we have about ourselves. Acclimatisation is real, and it helps, up to a point. A body used to heat sweats sooner and more efficiently than a body that is not. But acclimatisation works by making your cooling system better, and the wet bulb limit is the point where the cooling system stops working at all, no matter how good it is, because the air physically cannot accept any more moisture. You cannot train your way past a wall that is made of physics rather than fitness. The fittest, most heat-adapted labour on the planet, sweating perfectly, drinking endlessly, resting in full shade, still cannot shed heat into air that has no room left to take it. At the wet bulb limit, the strong and the acclimatised buy themselves a little time over the frail and the soft, and then they too begin to overheat, for the same reason, on the same unyielding physics. That is what makes this threat categorically different from the heat humanity has always known. Every previous heat disaster, however terrible, was in principle survivable by a healthy person who did the right things, who found shade and water and stayed still. The wet bulb crossing removes even that. It is the one heat that does not care how tough you are, how prepared you are, how much you want to live. It is not a test of character. It is a ceiling on biology, and we are, for the first time in the human story, building a world in which that ceiling reaches down into the ordinary places where ordinary people live their ordinary lives. The deadliest heat of the past, remember, was the survivable dry kind, the kind that killed by slow accumulation and fell hardest on the vulnerable. The heat that can actually overwhelm a healthy body in ours is the humid kind, and it is the kind that is rising fastest, bred in the warm, wet, crowded corners of the world where the moisture rides up with the temperature. We have spent this whole video tracing that distinction, from the physics of a single drop of sweat, to the chamber experiments and their shrinking number, to Karachi and the morgue that ran out of room, to the maps that put the danger over India and China and the eastern United States, to the records falling across Europe and the nights that will not cool over America. And it all converges on this one uncomfortable destination. The world is getting hotter than humans have ever known it, and the line where heat stops being survivable is real, and it is coming closer, and it is coming closer to home. There is an economic and human dimension to all of this that the physics alone can hide, and it deserves to be named before we talk about what to do. A world in which large regions cross the wet bulb line for part of every year is not only a world of heat deaths. It is a world in which whole categories of human activity become impossible outdoors during the hottest stretches, in which farm work and construction and every kind of outdoor labour must stop or move into the night, in which the rhythms of life in the hottest countries bend and break around the heat. Crops still need tending, buildings still need raising, but the people who do that work cannot survive doing it in uncompensable air. The line does not have to be crossed for very many hours a year to reshape how hundreds of millions of people can live and work and earn, and that disruption falls, once again, hardest on the poorest and the hottest places. It is also a world of movement, because when a place becomes genuinely unlivable for part of the year, people do not simply stay and accept it. They leave, or they try to, and the pressure of that movement reshapes nations far beyond the regions that cross the line. None of this is in the maps of wet bulb thresholds directly, but all of it follows from them, because human beings are not instruments in a chamber, sitting still and accepting the readings. They respond, they adapt where they can, and they move when they cannot, and the second-order consequences of the line ripple outward through economies and borders in ways that touch even the places that never themselves grow too hot to bear. But, and this is the turn that the same science insists on, the outcome is not yet written. The line is real, but how many people end up on the wrong side of it is still, for now, something we get to decide. And that is not wishful thinking. It is the most evidence-based statement in this entire story, because the same research that maps the danger also maps the difference between 2 degrees and 4, between a world that acts and a world that does not. The gap between those futures is measured in the number of regions that cross the line, the number of months they spend across it, the number of people exposed. That gap is enormous, and it is still open. Which means the most important part of this story is not the threat. It is the set of choices that determine how much of the threat actually arrives. Part 17. The things that still work. So what do we actually do about a line made of physics? A limit we cannot train past and cannot wish away? The honest answer is that there is no single solution, no one machine or policy that makes the problem disappear. But there is a set of things that genuinely work, that measurably keep people on the right side of the line, and they range from the planetary to the intensely local, from the grand to the almost humble. None of them is magic. All of them help. And together, they are the difference between the two futures the science describes. The single most powerful thing the world can do operates at the larger scale, and it follows directly from that fourth wall of the air conditioning trap. The deepest problem with our growing dependence on cooling was that it fed the warming that drives the heat. So the most important move is to break that loop, to move the world's power grids to clean energy fast enough to meet the soaring demand for cooling without burning more carbon to provide it. If the electricity that runs the world's tripling fleet of air conditioners comes from sources that do not heat the planet, then the cure stops feeding the disease. The cooling that keeps people alive stops making the underlying problem worse. That single shift, decarbonizing the power that we will inevitably use to cool ourselves, turns air conditioning from part of the trap into part of the escape. It is the one change that addresses both the immediate need to survive the next heatwave and the long-term need to stop making heatwaves worse. But not everyone will have air conditioning even in the best case, and the grid will sometimes fail no matter how well we build it. So the next layer of defence is to make the cities themselves fight the heat. And cities can do an astonishing amount, often with surprisingly simple tools. Consider the roofs. A dark roof absorbs the sun's heat and pours it into the building below and the air above. Paint that roof white, or a light reflective colour, and it bounces a large share of that heat straight back to the sky instead, cooling the building and the street at once. It is one of the cheapest interventions we have, and at the scale of a whole city, painting the rooftops light can measurably lower urban temperatures. Go a step further and make them green roofs, planted with vegetation, and they cool through shade and through the plant's own version of sweating while soaking up rainwater on the side. Down at street level, the most powerful tool is one of the oldest there is: shade. Trees, specifically, and lots of them. A street lined with mature trees can run dramatically cooler than a bare one, because the canopy blocks the sun before it ever reaches the pavement, and the trees themselves cool the air by releasing water vapour. The same evaporative physics that cools your skin, working in your favour for once at the scale of a neighbourhood. Planting trees and protecting the ones we have is among the most effective and least glamorous things a city can do to keep its people on the right side of the line. Alongside the trees come the deliberate refuges, networks of public cooling centres, places with reliable power and reliable cooling where anyone, regardless of whether they can afford to run their own air conditioner, can go to ride out the worst hours of a heatwave. In a genuine emergency, a well-run cooling centre is the difference between life and death for the people the first wall of the trap leaves behind. Underneath all of it sits the grid, and the lesson of Karachi is that the grid is the keystone. So hardening and modernising the power system, building it with the redundancy and the capacity to survive the hottest day rather than fail on it, is not a luxury. It is the foundation that every other defence rests on, because the cooling centres and the air conditioners and the water pumps all go dark the moment the power does. A grid built for the climate we are entering rather than the one we are leaving is one of the highest leverage investments a society can make. And finally, threaded through all of it, there is the most human layer of the response, and in some ways the most important, because it costs the least and saves the most. Heat kills the vulnerable, the old, the isolated, the poor, the sick, the people who cannot help themselves and have no one checking on them. And that means a huge share of heat deaths are preventable not with technology but with attention. Deliberate plans to find and protect the most vulnerable before a heatwave turns deadly, to know who they are and where they are, to check on the elderly neighbour living alone, to get the unhoused indoors, to open the centres and spread the word. These save lives in enormous numbers, and they do it with organisation and care rather than with money. In every one of those grinding dry catastrophes, from Paris to Russia, the people who died were disproportionately the ones no one came to check on. That is a wall we can take down with nothing more than the decision to look out for one another. There are quieter tools too, the kind that never make headlines but quietly decide who lives. Building codes can require that new homes be designed to shed heat rather than trap it, with insulation, shading, ventilation, and orientation that keep interiors livable even when the power fails, drawing on architectural wisdom that hot countries practice for centuries before cheap air conditioning let us forget it. Thick walls, light colours, shaded courtyards, windows placed to catch a cross breeze, all of it lowers the indoor temperature with no electricity at all, and all of it can be built back into how we make the places people live. Passive survivability, the ability of a building to keep its occupants alive through a heat wave even with no power, is becoming a design goal in exactly the places that need it most. Beyond the roofs and the trees, water itself can be turned into a public defence rather than a private gamble. Cities in hot countries have long understood that fountains, shaded misting stations, splash pads, and freely accessible drinking water are not amenities, but lifelines during a heat wave, and the ones that build them generously give their people a place to shed heat that does not depend on owning anything or paying anyone. The same goes for simply opening doors. Libraries, transit stations, shopping centres, and public buildings that already run cooling can be designated as official refuges, their hours extended and their locations advertised, so that no one has to wonder where to go when the air turns dangerous. None of this is expensive compared to the cost of the dead, and all of it widens the margin for exactly the people the first wall of the cooling trap leaves stranded. And then there are the early warning systems, the heat action plans that treat a coming heat wave the way we have learned to treat a coming hurricane, with named thresholds, public alerts, and a clear chain of response that opens the cooling centres, checks on the vulnerable, and tells people plainly that this is the dangerous kind of heat, and here is what to do. Cities that have adopted serious heat action plans after living through their own disasters have measurably cut their death tolls in later heat waves. The heat did not get less severe, the response got better. That is perhaps the most hopeful fact in this entire story, the proof that preparation, organisation, and warning genuinely move the number of the dead, and that a society which decides to take this seriously can save a great many of the people it would otherwise lose. None of these things on its own stops the planet from warming, but every one of them moves the line, or moves people away from it, and stacked together they represent the gap between a world that loses tens of thousands to each great heat wave and one that loses far, far fewer. The physics of the limit is fixed, the number of people who reach it is not. Part 18. The line we still get to draw. So we arrive back where we began, at the records falling across Europe and the heat dome swelling over America, but you see them differently now. You know that the numbers shattering on the thermometers were never quite the real story. You know that there is a second temperature, the one that sweats, the one that measures not how hot the air is, but whether your body can still cool itself at all. You know that the line it marks is lower than science believed even a few years ago, that it has been found in laboratories with swallowed capsules and curves bending upward on a screen, and that it runs, depending on who you are and what you are doing, somewhere across that range we measured. And you know where it is heading. Toward the warm, the wet, the crowded places. Toward India and China and the eastern half of the United States. Toward home. You know, too, that this is not waiting for some distant decade. The children and the elderly who died in France this June did not die from a projection in a journal. They died from the exact mechanism, in the exact week, that this story has been describing. The nights that will not cool over the American Midwest are not a forecast for the future. They are this week's forecast. The line is being tested right now in real cities, on real bodies, on both sides of the ocean at once, and the most vulnerable among us are, exactly as the science predicted, the first to feel it. And yet, the most important fact in all of this is not the threat. It is that the threat is not fixed. The deadliest heat of the past was the dry kind, the survivable kind, and the truly unsurvivable humid heat is still, today, rare enough that most people have never even heard its name. We are not yet living in the world of the 4-degree maps. We are standing at the edge of it, looking in with the road still forking in front of us. The difference between the world where the line stays mostly offshore and the world where it reaches deep into where we live is measured in choices that have not yet been made, the grids we build or fail to build, the carbon we burn or stop burning, the roofs and the trees and the cooling centres, the neighbours we check on or do not. None of this asks you to despair, and that distinction matters because despair and denial lead to the same place, which is doing nothing. The point of understanding the line is not to be paralysed by it, but to see clearly where the leverage is, and the leverage is real, and it is everywhere along the chain we have traced. It is in the power plants and the policies that decide how fast the grid goes clean. It is in the design of a roof, the planting of a street, the funding of a cooling centre, the writing of a heat plan, the decision to knock on an elderly neighbour's door when the forecast turns dangerous. Each of those is a place where the number of people who reach the line gets smaller, and none of them requires us to repeal physics. They require only that we take the threat as seriously as the science does. There is a measurable physical limit to what a human body can endure, and we did not get to choose where nature drew it. But we do, still, for now, get to choose how many people are forced to meet it. The thermometer outside your window measures the air. It cannot measure the thing that actually decides who lives, and it cannot tell you how close that line already is. That number is climbing, quietly, underneath the headlines, in the moisture that warming itself keeps adding to the sky. The world is becoming hotter than human beings have ever known it. The line where heat stops being something we endure and becomes something we cannot survive is real, and it is moving toward us. The only question still open, the only one that was ever really asked to answer, is how many of us end up on the wrong side of it. And that line, unlike the one written in our biology, is still ours to draw.